Who would win in a fight, Blitzcrank from League of Legends or Pudge from Dota 2? We'll put these two up against each other in two different ways, one the battle of the lore and one the battle of the in-game abilities. First up is the battle of the in-game abilities. If you need a refresher on any of the heroes' abilities, here they are now. If not, go to the time on the video right now to start the battle. The first hero we'll be looking at is Pudge. He has a passive where every time he kills somebody, he gains a stack of flesh heap, which gives him a permanent amount of strength, which in Dota equals to HP. His Q is a long-range hook that can hook both allies and enemies, but only deals damage to enemies, and it deals damage in the form of pure damage, which is equivalent to true damage in League. His W is a small AoE centered around himself that he can toggle on and off, and it does damage to both himself and enemies while slowing enemies down. His E is an activated ability that during the duration of it, he takes reduced damage from all sources. Pudge's ultimate is a point-and-click CC ability that when it hits you, it slowly pulls you towards him and deals damage based on Pudge's strength. Blitzcrank's passive activates when he's low on health and gives him a shield immediately for 30% of his mana. Blitzcrank's Q is a hook that can target enemies only and pulls them towards him. Blitzcrank's W overcharges his movement speed and he gains a large burst of movement speed that slowly decays, and eventually at the end of it he gets slowed for 1 second. Blitzcrank's E overcharges and resets his auto attack, and when you hit your next target, it knocks them up into the air. Blitz's ultimate has two modes. When it's not on cooldown, it has a passive effect to strike lightning at whatever target you're targeting. When you activate it, it does a large AoE burst of damage that also silences enemies. Now that you understand both heroes, let's get to the battle of the in-game abilities. Both characters have a way to scale. Pudge has an indefinite scaling through his HP on his passive, but Blitzcrank can get a little bit of scaling through his shield, which is going to be somewhat helpful in the fight because Pudge doesn't have too much burst, but I don't think it's going to be able to trigger twice. So I think as far as scaling goes, Pudge would definitely win in a larger game just due to the infinite scaling potential, and Blitzcrank really falls off towards that mid game if he doesn't have somebody else with him to secure kills. In the early game, it's going to be a toss-up because Blitzcrank has a way to keep his distance through the extra movement speed, and Pudge is just this lumbering target, so he's an easy hook. But I don't think necessarily Blitzcrank wants to hook Pudge, because as soon as Pudge is in range, his W gets the slow off and he's able to stay in range. Pudge also has the ability to clear waves much faster without committing as much resources. He can go up into a little wave and just hold his W down and just clear the entire wave while taking some chip damage. Blitzcrank has no way to clear a wave outside of committing his ultimate, and if he ever commits his ultimate, he immediately will lose a fight as he doesn't have any more damage to him. Pudge, I think, is just going to be too resilient for Blitzcrank to really do anything to. As soon as Pudge gets any type of magic resist, there's no amount of damage that Blitzcrank could ever get to deal any significant damage to get within a kill range on his own. I really don't see any way that Pudge could ever lose this matchup unless they're in some kind of duo lane where Blitzcrank's ADC just destroys Pudge. But in all reality, I think Pudge is going to get away with a lot more. He's not going to be able to be as strong on the ganks, but he's definitely going to be winning in that lane and being oppressive in that lane. And with all that being said, I think that Pudge is just declared the absolute winner of the battle of the in-game abilities. Now before we move on to the battle of the lore, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Pudge was a royal butcher to a king that went to war so often that Pudge eventually developed a taste for flesh. After the king had passed, Pudge had realized that he was immune to most forms of natural decay. He found himself on the fields of the endless carnage, where he roams around every day, butchering the dead carcasses, eating them and attaching parts of their flesh to his own. He grows in size every day and is ever hungry. Through his travels, Pudge found chains that belonged to the dead god, and the dead god saw this as an act, so he put out a hit onto Pudge. However, Pudge enjoyed talking to the chains, and they would sometimes even talk back to him. He once started to amass a cult following of people who would follow and do acts just like him, but eventually he grew too hungry and ate them too. Blitzcrank comes from the city of Zon, a place of wondrous experimentation and vibrant, colorful life. The golems around here are used to clear out toxic waste produced by all the experimentation and machinations. One day, an experimenter named Victor decided to put a Hextech core inside of the chassis of one of these golems. It sprang to life to become our favorite hooker, Blitzcrank. Victor would learn that Blitzcrank was actually sentient and he could learn on his own, but not quite in the best way possible. One time he was given an order to help somebody who had lost a key into their house, so instead of finding the key, he just broke down the door to let them in. Blitzcrank's programming was to remove all toxic waste from Zon, so seeing the problem, he went to one of the Chemtech factories and destroyed the factory itself. The Chemtech Baron went to Victor's house and demanded that Blitzcrank be shut down now or he would kill Victor. Saddened, Victor went to go find Blitzcrank, but he realized that Blitzcrank had already left and he was nowhere to be found. But there are still some sightings of a tall, cloaked golem that runs around helping Zonites. So now that you know their history, let's get into the Battle of the Lore. Seeing the death and decay on the fields of endless carnage, Blitzcrank would want to go there to help clean up any disease that could eventually lead into Zon. While moving around bodies and burning them, he would eventually wander onto the path of Pudge, who would come running to the smell of burning flesh.
Boy, fresh meat!
Pudge would scream coming over the hill.
Precisely,
Would be Blitzcrank's reply. He would see no need to keep the bodies around, but Pudge in anger would throw a hook at him, pulling him towards him.
Get over here!
As Blitzcrank was pulled within reach of Pudge, he would immediately release an electric shock.
Ugh.
Pudge fell to the ground. He had never seen something like this before. There was no flesh that he could carve away. It was only metal. After a quick scan, Blitzcrank would see the fumes exuding off of Pudge and see that he was a problem that carried only decay with him.
exterminate.
Blitzcrank would fist Pudge, punching him up into the air, and when Pudge landed, there was a quake on the ground from his size. Pudge realized that he wasn't against a normal fleshling that he could just simply consume. He would have to adapt as well. The battle would rage on for hours, Blitzcrank slowly ripping away the layers of flesh on Pudge after tearing into the metal so much.
Metal is harder than flesh.
Blitzcrank would taunt, but in a flash, Pudge would hook Blitzcrank to him. In a last-ditch strength of effort, Pudge would begin devouring the metal on Blitzcrank. Blitzcrank could do nothing but stare at the horror that was unfolding upon himself. He was losing parts of himself, being ripped apart and eaten by Pudge. Pudge would leave Blitzcrank's head untouched and would attach it to himself. It was nice to have a friend to talk to as he continued to wander the fields of endless carnage.